Most people think fate arrives like lightning. Loud, obvious, impossible to ignore. Mine arrived bleeding beneath a bridge at 2:13 in the morning, while freezing rain soaked through my sneakers and turned New York into a city made of shadows. I almost kept walking. God knows I should have. My shift at Hartwell Books Cafe had ended 40 minutes earlier, and every part of my body hurt from shelving hardcovers and serving overpriced espresso to businessmen who never looked me in the eye. The rain hammered against the streets hard enough to blur the traffic lights into streaks of red and gold, and all I wanted was my tiny apartment in Queens, dry socks, and 6 hours of sleep before doing it all over again. Then I heard something. Not a shout. Not footsteps. A low sound somewhere between pain and exhaustion. I stopped beneath the overpass, tightening my coat around myself as cold water dripped from the steel beams overhead. The city suddenly felt too quiet. Cars hissed through puddles above me. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed through Manhattan. But under the bridge, there was only darkness and that strange, uneven breathing. My stomach tightened instantly. Every woman in New York learns the same rule eventually. Don't investigate strange noises after midnight. Don't stop. Don't look. Survive first. I should have listened. Instead, I took one step forward. Then another. My phone flashlight shook in my hand as the beam cut across wet concrete and graffiti-covered pillars until it landed on a man sitting against the wall beneath the bridge. Blood stained the sleeve of his black coat, dark and slick beneath the rain. For one horrible second, I thought he might already be dead. But then his head lifted slowly, and those eyes found mine. I forgot how to breathe. He looked younger than I expected. Early 30s maybe. Dark hair soaked from the storm. Sharp features tense with pain. There was something dangerous about him, even sitting there half-conscious against cold concrete. Something controlled. Predatory. Like the kind of man who made rooms fall silent when he entered them. His gaze locked onto me with frightening focus despite the blood on his shoulder. Don't, he said quietly. His voice was rough, strained. Don't call the cops. I should have turned around right then. Instead, I moved closer before my brain could catch up with my stupidity. Rainwater soaked through the knees of my jeans as I crouched beside him. Up close, I noticed details that made my pulse stutter. The expensive watch on his wrist. The black dress, shirt beneath the coat. The faint outline of a tattoo disappearing beneath his collar. Nothing about him belonged under a bridge bleeding alone at 2 in the morning. You're hurt, I whispered. His jaw tightened slightly, like he was trying not to react to the pain. I noticed. Even injured, he sounded calm. Controlled. That scared me more than the blood. My hands trembled as I pulled my scarf from my neck and pressed it carefully against his shoulder. He sucked in a slow breath, but never looked away from me. Those eyes were pale green. Cold and sharp one second. Exhausted the next. Why are you helping me? He asked quietly. I opened my mouth, then closed it again because honestly, I didn't know. Maybe because nobody had helped my father the night he collapsed outside our apartment building 3 winters ago. Maybe because loneliness recognizes itself in strangers. Or maybe because despite every survival instinct screaming at me to run, something about this man felt important in a way I couldn't explain. Thunder rolled above the bridge. Water dripped steadily beside us. And for one strange second, the entire city felt very far away. Then his hand suddenly caught my wrist. Firm. Warm despite the rain. His breathing changed sharply as headlights swept briefly beneath the overpass. Fear flashed across his face for the first time. Real fear. Claire, he murmured, staring at me like he already knew me somehow. You shouldn't have found me. The way he said my name hollowed something out inside my chest, because I had never seen this man before in my life. I was sure of it. Yet he looked at me with the kind of recognition people carried after years, not seconds. Rainwater streamed down his face, catching against the sharp line of his jaw while his grip tightened slightly around my wrist. Not enough to hurt, just enough to stop me from pulling away. How do you know my name? I whispered. For a second, confusion flickered across his expression. Then exhaustion swallowed it. His eyes drifted shut briefly, like staying conscious required effort. I do not, he muttered quietly. Forget it. The headlights disappeared from beneath the bridge, leaving only darkness and the steady roar of rain above us. I glanced toward the street nervously. Every instinct told me something was wrong here. Not normal wrong. Dangerous wrong. The kind people on the evening news always described afterward with words like suspicious circumstances an ongoing investigation. I swallowed hard and looked back at the blood soaking through my scarf. You need a hospital. His eyes opened instantly. Cold again. Sharp enough to make me freeze. No hospitals. You could pass out. I will survive. The confidence in his voice made no sense considering he could barely sit upright. I shifted closer carefully, trying to ignore how expensive his coat felt beneath my fingers or how out of place he seemed under a filthy bridge in Queens. Men like him belonged in penthouses and black SUVs, not bleeding into rainwater after midnight. Can you stand? I asked. His jaw flexed once before he nodded slightly. For a minute, I slipped underneath his arm before I could reconsider the stupidity of this entire situation. The second his weight leaned against me, I nearly lost my balance. He was taller than I realized. Broad shoulders, heavy in the way strong men always are. But he tried not to put too much pressure on me, even injured. That detail unsettled me more than anything else. Dangerous men were not supposed to be careful. We moved slowly toward the street, while freezing rain soaked through my coat and into my skin. My old Honda Civic waited half a block away beneath a flickering streetlight, looking painfully small compared to the kind of cars I imagined this man usually traveled in. Halfway there, he stopped suddenly. Every muscle in his body went rigid beneath my arm. What is wrong? I whispered. He stared across the street toward a black SUV idling near the corner. Tinted windows. Engine running. My heartbeat stumbled instantly. Keep walking, he said quietly. The calmness in his voice terrified me more than panic would have. Do not look at them. Them. My throat tightened. I kept my eyes forward and forced my legs to move even though every survival instinct screamed at me to run. The SUV stayed where it was. Watching. Rain hammered against the pavement loud enough to cover the sound of my breathing. By the time we reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice. He leaned against the passenger door while scanning the empty street with the alertness of someone used to danger. Even hurt, he looked in control, like he had spent his entire life surviving things ordinary people never saw. I finally unlocked the car and helped him into the passenger seat. The inside instantly filled with the scent of rain, cold air, and expensive cologne beneath the metallic trace of blood. He let his head fall back against the seat with a quiet exhale. Streetlights flashed across his face as I climbed behind the wheel. For the first time since finding him, I noticed the faint scar near his temple. The expensive silver watch still wrapped around his wrist. The black ring on his right hand engraved with a symbol I did not recognize. Nothing about him felt accidental. I turned the key in the ignition. My Honda coughed twice before starting. Where do I take you? I asked softly. His eyes opened slowly and settled on me again. Tired. Intense. Impossible to read. Home, he murmured. Then, after a long pause that made my pulse quicken for reasons I could not explain, he added quietly, Take me somewhere nobody will think to look for me. The drive back to my apartment felt unreal, like the city outside my windshield had slipped sideways into someone else's life. Rain streaked across the glass in silver lines while old jazz crackled softly through my broken speakers because I forgot to turn the radio off. Beside me, the stranger stayed quiet. Too quiet. Most injured people groaned or complained, or at least breathed loudly enough to remind you they were alive. He just sat there with one hand pressed against his shoulder, staring out the passenger window like he was calculating every car that passed us. Twice, I caught him checking the rearview mirror. The second time, his eyes met mine briefly. You are nervous, he said quietly. I let out a short laugh. There is a bleeding stranger in my car at almost 3 a.m. Yes, I am nervous. For the first time since I found him beneath the bridge, something close to amusement touched the corner of his mouth. It disappeared quickly, but I saw it. Fair. We stopped at a red light near Queens Boulevard. Neon signs reflected against wet pavement while steam curled from subway grates into the freezing air. The city looked beautiful at night if you ignored how lonely it could feel. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Do you at least have a name? Silence stretched for a second too long. Damien, he finally said. Just Damien. No last name. No explanation. Somehow that made him feel even more dangerous. By the time we pulled into the cracked parking lot behind my apartment building, my nerves were stretched so thin I could feel every heartbeat in my throat. My building looked exactly the way it always did. For stories of faded brick, flickering hallway lights, a broken security camera nobody ever fixed. Normal. Safe. Except nothing about tonight felt normal anymore. Damien stepped out of the car carefully, hiding the pain well enough that somebody passing by might not notice he was injured at all. But I noticed. His breathing had become slower, tighter, controlled the way people breathe when they are trying very hard not to show weakness. I helped him toward the back stairwell while freezing rain soaked through both of us. Halfway up the stairs, his hand suddenly closed around the railing hard enough that his knuckles turned white. Damien. He shook his head once. Keep moving. The hallway smelled faintly like old radiator heat and somebody's burnt dinner from 3 floors down. I unlocked apartment 3B with shaking fingers and pushed the door open. Warm air wrapped around us instantly. My apartment was tiny. 1 bedroom. Second-hand couch. Stacks of books everywhere because working at a bookstore meant constantly bringing damaged copies. Home. A tiny kitchen barely big enough for one person to stand in comfortably. Normally, I felt embarrassed bringing people here. Tonight, I barely noticed. Damien paused just inside the doorway, scanning the apartment automatically. Windows. Fire escape. Hallway. Entrances. He studied everything in less than 3 seconds. The realization sent another wave of unease through me. Men did not move like that unless they had spent their lives expecting danger. Sit down, I said softly. He lowered himself onto the couch with controlled care while rainwater dripped from his coat onto the hardwood floor. Up close beneath real light, he looked worse than before. Pale skin, damp black hair falling across his forehead, blood soaking through the dark fabric near his shoulder despite the pressure he kept holding there. My stomach twisted. I need to see the wound. His eyes lifted to mine instantly. Sharp again. You should not. You are in my apartment, bleeding on my couch. I think we passed the point of privacy. Another pause. Then slowly, he removed his coat. My breath caught before I could stop it. Not because of the blood. Because of the scars. Thin silver lines crossed his shoulder and collarbone beneath the black shirt, like old memories carved into skin. None of them looked accidental. Damien noticed me staring and pulled the fabric back into place immediately. Do not look at me like that, he said quietly. Like what? His gaze held mine for one heavy second. Like you still think I am worth saving. His words should have scared me enough to throw him back out into the rain. Instead, something about the exhaustion in his voice pulled at me in ways I could not explain. Maybe because monsters were not supposed to look tired. They were not supposed to sit quietly on second-hand couches bleeding through expensive black shirts while rain tapped softly against apartment windows. I grabbed the small first aid kit from beneath my bathroom sink and returned carefully. Damien watched every movement I made without speaking. Not suspicious exactly. Aware. Like his brain never fully rested. This is going to hurt, I warned quietly as I knelt beside the couch. One corner of his mouth lifted faintly again. You assume pain is unfamiliar to me. I ignored that. My hands trembled slightly as I cleaned the wound the best I could. It looked serious, but not life-threatening from what little medical knowledge I had collected through internet searches and surviving life in New York without health insurance. Damien barely reacted while I worked. No complaints. No dramatic groaning. Just silence and those pale green eyes following me with unsettling intensity. The apartment felt smaller with him inside it. Too warm. Too quiet. Every sound suddenly mattered. The ticking radiator. Rain hitting glass. The soft rustle of fabric whenever he shifted slightly on the couch. You always help strangers? He asked after several minutes. Only the bleeding ones. That is a terrible survival strategy. I am beginning to realize that. A low sound escaped him then. Not quite laughter, but close. I finished wrapping the bandage around his shoulder carefully and leaned back slightly to study my work. There. You probably need stitches. Probably. You should still go to a hospital. His expression changed instantly at the word hospital. The warmth vanished from his face so fast it gave me chills. No, not loud. Not emotional. Final. I stared at him for a second before nodding slowly. Whatever history lived behind that answer clearly was not something he intended to explain. I stood and moved toward the kitchen, needing distance more than water. My tiny apartment suddenly felt dangerously intimate with him sitting there in silence, while stormlight flickered across the walls. I handed him a glass anyway. Drink. He accepted it carefully, fingers brushing mine for half a second. Warm. Steady. Dangerous. I hated that I noticed all three. Midnight had long passed into something deeper by then. The kind of hour where loneliness always feels heavier. Damien rested back against the couch while I pretended to organize books near the window just to avoid staring at him. Outside, the rain still drowned the city in silver haze. Somewhere below, a car alarm echoed briefly before cutting off again. Normal New York noise. Yet the apartment no longer felt normal. Claire. My name sounded strange in his voice. Too familiar somehow. I turned slowly. He was watching the framed photograph sitting crooked beside my bookshelf. Me at 16 beside my father before the drinking hollowed him out completely. That your family? He asked quietly. I nodded once. Just me now. Something unreadable flickered across his face. Guilt maybe. Sadness. It disappeared too quickly to hold on to. I am sorry. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. Men like him were supposed to say threatening things. Cold things. Not apologies whispered after 3 in the morning beneath dim apartment lights. You do not even know what happened, I said softly. I know loss when I see it. Silence settled between us after that. Heavy but strangely calm. I checked the clock on the microwave. 3:47 in the morning. My entire body ached with exhaustion, but adrenaline still buzzed beneath my skin hard enough to keep sleep far away. You can take the couch, I said finally. I will survive one night. Damien studied me carefully. You trust people too easily. I almost laughed at that because if he knew half the things life had taught me, he would realize trust had nothing to do with this. Sometimes people simply got tired of walking away from suffering. I moved toward my bedroom doorway before stopping. For the record, I said quietly without looking back at him, I still do not know if you are a good person. The apartment went silent behind me for a moment. Then his low voice drifted softly through the darkness. Claire. I glanced back. Damien sat motionless beneath the dim kitchen light, shadows cutting across his face while rain whispered against the windows. His expression looked almost human for the first time all night. Neither do I. I woke to silence, so complete it felt wrong. For a second, I forgot about the storm. Forgot about the stranger sleeping on my couch. Then the smell of coffee hit me, rich and warm against the cold gray light filtering through my apartment windows, and every memory from the night before rushed back at once. My heart jumped hard enough to hurt. I sat upright immediately, tangled in blankets, staring toward the living room. Empty. The couch cushions were slightly indented, but Damien was gone. Panic moved through me faster than logic. I threw off the blanket and hurried barefoot into the apartment. The front door was still locked, the chain untouched. Rain no longer hammered the windows, but the sky outside remained heavy and silver with early morning clouds. Damien. The name felt strange leaving my mouth in daylight. No answer. Then I noticed the kitchen. My tiny counter looked different somehow. Cleaner. Organized. A steaming mug sat beside the sink, and for one deeply confusing second, I simply stared at it because nobody had made me coffee in years. Slowly, I approached the counter. The mug was warm beneath my fingers. Fresh. Beside it sat a folded black cloth stained faintly pink from dried blood, and underneath that, money. My stomach dropped instantly. Several crisp $100 bills rested neatly beside the coffee mug like this was somehow normal behavior. Like men appeared bleeding in your apartment at 3 in the morning and paid you before disappearing by sunrise. I grabbed the money immediately, offended before I even fully understood why. Unbelievable, I muttered under my breath. The apartment suddenly felt colder without him there. Quieter too. I hated noticing that. My eyes drifted toward the couch again before catching on something silver near the armrest. A watch. The same expensive watch he wore beneath the bridge. Heavy. Elegant. Definitely worth more than everything inside my apartment combined. I picked it up carefully. The metal still held faint warmth. He had not left long ago. Beneath it sat a folded piece of paper torn from one of my bookstore receipts. Thank you for saving a monster. No signature. No explanation. Just those 6 words written in sharp, precise handwriting. I stared at the note longer than I should have. Then my phone buzzed violently against the kitchen counter, nearly making me jump out of my skin. Mia flashed across the screen. My best friend and coworker. I answered immediately. Please tell me you are not late again, she said without greeting. Mrs. Patterson already asked where you are twice and she still thinks your name is Clara. I rubbed exhausted fingers against my forehead. I am awake. Barely. You sound weird. If only she knew. I glanced toward the empty couch again. Long night. You need therapy and sleep. Preferably both. Despite everything, I smiled faintly. I am leaving soon. After hanging up, I moved automatically through my morning routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every few minutes my eyes drifted back toward the note beside the coffee mug, toward the watch, toward the empty space Damien had occupied only hours earlier. I should have thrown the money away. I should have forgotten him completely. Instead, I tucked the folded note carefully into my jacket pocket before leaving for work. Outside, New York smelled like wet pavement and cold air after rain. The city had already returned to its usual chaos. Taxi horns, steam rising from manholes, people rushing through crosswalks carrying overpriced coffee and unfinished conversations. Normal. Completely normal. Yet halfway through my subway ride into Manhattan, two men in dark suits stepped onto the train at Lexington Avenue, and every nerve in my body instantly tightened. They were not looking at me directly, but something about them felt familiar. Expensive coats, sharp eyes, controlled movements. One of them spoke quietly into an earpiece beneath the sound of screeching train brakes. My pulse stumbled hard. Impossible. I turned away quickly, gripping the silver watch tighter inside my coat pocket. But just before the subway doors closed again, I heard one sentence drift across the crowded train car in a low, serious voice. Find Damien Moretti before somebody else does. The rest of the subway ride felt too hot despite the freezing weather outside. My pulse stayed uneven while the two men in dark coats stood near the opposite doors, speaking quietly into their earpieces like something out of a crime movie nobody sane would want to be part of. I kept my head down and stared at my reflection in the train window, trying to look invisible. Ordinary. Just another tired bookstore employee heading into Manhattan with cheap coffee breath and student loan debt. But my fingers would not stop, tightening around Damien's watch inside my pocket. Moretti. The name echoed through my head the entire ride downtown. It sounded important. Dangerous. Familiar in the way certain names always do even before you understand why. By the time I reached Hartwell Books Cafe, anxiety sat beneath my ribs like cold metal. The cafe smelled like cinnamon pastries and espresso beans, warm enough to fog the windows against the chilly morning outside. Usually the place calmed me instantly. Rows of books, soft jazz, tourists pretending to read literary fiction while taking photos for social media. Safe. Predictable. Today, even that felt fragile somehow. Mia looked up from the register the second I walked in. Okay, now you definitely look weird. I hung my coat near the back office and forced a tired smile. Thanks. No, seriously. Did you join a cult overnight? Not that I remember. She narrowed her eyes suspiciously while handing me an apron. You look like somebody followed you home. My stomach tightened hard enough to hurt. Too close. Way too close. Before I could answer, the bell above the cafe door chimed softly. Every conversation inside the bookstore seemed to fade for one strange, suspended second. I turned automatically toward the entrance and forgot how to breathe. Damien stood just inside the doorway wearing a charcoal gray suit, so perfectly tailored it looked unreal against the backdrop of dusty bookshelves and half-finished cappuccinos. His dark hair was neatly pushed back now. Clean. Controlled. No blood. No exhaustion. The dangerous stranger from beneath the bridge had vanished completely. This man looked powerful enough to own entire city blocks. Behind him stood two men in black coats near the entrance, silent and watchful. Not bodyguards exactly. Something colder. More professional. My heartbeat crashed against my ribs. Damien's eyes found mine instantly across the crowded cafe. Calm. Steady. Familiar. Like he had expected me to be there all along. Mia leaned closer beside me. Oh my God, she whispered. Please tell me that man is not staring at you. I could not answer. Damien moved through the bookstore slowly, and people stepped aside without even realizing they were doing it. Wealth has its own gravity in New York. So does danger. He stopped directly in front of the counter while the entire cafe seemed to hold its breath around him. Up close, he somehow looked even more intimidating in daylight. Expensive watch missing from his wrist. Pale green eyes sharper than before. A faint scar near his temple catching beneath the warm cafe lights. Claire, he said quietly. My name sounded different coming from him here. Too intimate for daylight. Too dangerous for someplace ordinary. I swallowed hard. You left. One corner of his mouth moved slightly. You sound disappointed. You left money on my counter. You saved my life. That does not make us even. Something unreadable flickered across his expression then. Amusement maybe. Or surprise. Behind him, customers pretended not to stare while absolutely staring. Mia looked seconds away from passing out from curiosity. Damien reached into his coat slowly and placed something on the counter between us. My breath caught instantly. A small silver key attached to a black leather tag. What is this? I asked quietly. A safer apartment than yours. My heart stumbled. Excuse me. You were followed this morning after leaving Queens. Ice flooded straight through my chest. Damien's voice remained calm, controlled, like he was discussing whether instead of destroying my sense of safety in one sentence. The men on the train were not looking for me anymore, he continued softly. They were looking for the woman who helped me disappear. The cafe suddenly felt too bright, too open. I stared at him while fear curled slowly through my stomach. Who are you? For the first time since walking through the door, Damien's expression darkened slightly. Not angry, regretful, heavy. His eyes held mine as he answered in a voice quiet enough that only I could hear it. Someone your world should never have touched. The air between us changed after that sentence. I felt it immediately. The warmth of the cafe faded beneath something colder, heavier, like invisible doors had just closed around my life without asking permission first. Around us, espresso machines hissed and pages turned and tourists laughed near the travel section, completely unaware that my entire sense of normal had cracked open in the middle of a bookstore. I stared at Damien while my pulse hammered painfully beneath my ribs. You do not get to walk into my job and say things like that without explaining anything. His expression barely shifted. Calm, controlled, but exhaustion still lived underneath it somewhere. I could see it now if I looked carefully enough. Claire, he said softly, I am trying to keep you alive. From what? A long pause. His eyes flicked briefly toward the cafe windows where cold gray rain still misted against Manhattan sidewalks. From people who will assume you matter to me. The words landed harder than they should have. Not romantic. Not comforting. Dangerous. Mia appeared beside me suddenly, carrying a tray of pastries, completely oblivious to the emotional earthquake happening 2 feet away. Hi, she said slowly while staring at Damien like she had forgotten how blinking worked. Can I help you with anything? Damien's entire demeanor shifted instantly toward politeness, so smooth it almost made me angry. Just coffee, he answered calmly. Black. Mia nodded too quickly. Right. Of course. Black coffee. Totally normal. She disappeared toward the espresso machine while throwing me a look that clearly promised interrogation later. I crossed my arms tightly. You are scaring me. Something dark flickered behind Damien's eyes at that. Regret maybe. Good, he said quietly. Fear keeps people cautious. And what keeps people like you cautious? For the first time since he entered the cafe, silence caught him off guard. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. But I noticed. Damien leaned slightly closer then, lowering his voice enough that only I could hear him over the soft music playing through the bookstore speakers. People like me do not survive long enough to become careless. My throat tightened unexpectedly. There was no arrogance in the statement. Just truth. Heavy and exhausted and lonely. Before I could answer, one of the men near the entrance stepped forward slightly. Tall, broad shoulders beneath a dark coat. An earpiece hidden beneath. Closely cropped hair. Sir, he said quietly. Damien's jaw tightened instantly. Not now. The man hesitated before nodding once and stepping back again. Sir. The word echoed strangely in my chest. Not Mr. Not boss. Sir. I looked between them slowly. Who exactly are you? Damien held my gaze for a long moment before answering. A businessman. I almost laughed. You were bleeding beneath a bridge at 2 in the morning. New York is stressful. Despite myself, a short startled laugh escaped me. Damien watched me carefully when it happened, like the sound mattered more than it should. Then his expression softened in a way that made my chest feel suddenly unsteady. Dangerous men should not have gentle expressions. That felt unfair somehow. Mia returned with his coffee and placed it carefully on the counter. Here you go. Damien nodded politely. Thank you. Mia stared at him another full second before walking away in visible confusion. I lowered my voice immediately. You still did not answer my question. Damien wrapped one hand around the coffee cup without drinking from it. And you still have my watch. My fingers instinctively tightened around my coat pocket. You left it. No, his eyes lifted slowly back to mine. I did not. The meaning hit me instantly. My pulse stumbled hard. He left it on purpose. Not forgotten. Left. Why? I whispered. Damien studied me with that same unreadable intensity from beneath the bridge. The entire cafe seemed too small suddenly, too bright, too ordinary for whatever this conversation was becoming. Finally, he spoke in a voice so quiet I almost missed it. Because if I disappeared again, he said softly, I needed something important left somewhere safe. My breath caught. Then the bell above the cafe door chimed again. Damien's expression changed instantly. Every trace of warmth vanished from his face as his eyes shifted toward the entrance behind me. I turned automatically and felt ice flood through my veins. Two men stood just inside the bookstore scanning the room slowly. Dark coats, hard eyes. One of them held a photograph in his hand. And even from across the cafe, I knew it was mine. Every instinct inside me screamed to run. The two men near the entrance did not look like customers. They moved too carefully, watched too closely. One of them held my photograph while scanning faces inside the cafe with the calm focus of someone used to finding people who did not want to be found. My pulse crashed against my ribs so hard it hurt. Damien, I whispered. He was already standing. The warmth from seconds ago disappeared completely, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Not loud, not dramatic, just absolute control. The kind that silenced entire rooms without trying. Do exactly what I say, he said quietly. What is happening? You are leaving with me. My heart stumbled. I am not going anywhere with Claire. The way he said my name stopped me cold. Calm, firm, final. Behind him, the two men had started moving deeper into the bookstore. One of them spoke quietly into an earpiece while still holding my photograph. I suddenly became hyper-aware of everything around me. The elderly couple reading travel guides near the front windows. The college students laughing by the coffee station. Mia reorganizing pastries behind the register, completely unaware that danger had just walked through the front door. I cannot just leave, I whispered sharply. I work here. Damien's eyes flicked toward Mia briefly before settling back on me. If they realize who helped me, this place becomes unsafe. Fear slid cold fingers down my spine. He was not exaggerating. That somehow terrified me most of all. One of the men near the entrance suddenly looked directly toward the counter. Toward me. Recognition flashed across his face instantly. Damien moved before I could react. One hand settled lightly against the small of my back, guiding me toward the side hallway leading to the employee exit. Not rough. Not possessive. Protective. The contact sent confusion spiraling through my chest anyway. Sir, one of Damien's men appeared beside us immediately. The car is ready. Sir again. My breathing felt uneven as Damien guided me through the narrow hallway behind the cafe kitchen. Employees stared as we passed. A dishwasher paused mid-conversation. Someone dropped a tray behind us with a loud metallic crash. Damien never slowed down. The back exit opened into a narrow alley soaked from earlier rain. Black SUVs lined the curb outside like something from a political convoy. Engines running. Windows tinted dark enough to reflect the gray Manhattan sky. My feet stopped moving automatically. Absolutely not. Damien turned toward me fully then. Claire, you do not get to drag me into whatever this is. I am trying to keep you breathing. By kidnapping me. Something dangerous flickered briefly across his face at the word. Hurt maybe. Gone too fast to hold on to. If I wanted to force you, he said quietly, you would already be inside the car. The terrifying part was that I believed him instantly. One of the suited men near the alley entrance touched his earpiece suddenly. They spotted her. Everything changed after that. Damien's attention snapped toward the street instantly. Sharp. Predatory. Controlled. The atmosphere around him shifted so fast it stole my breath. He stepped closer to me automatically, placing himself slightly between me and the mouth of the alley without even seeming to think about it. Get in the car, he said quietly. No anger. No panic. Just certainty. Voices echoed somewhere near the bookstore entrance. Closer than before. My pulse climbed painfully higher. Claire. Damien's eyes locked onto mine with terrifying focus. You trusted me once beneath that bridge. Rainwater dripped steadily from fire escapes overhead while New York traffic roared beyond the alley like another world entirely. I stared at him in disbelief. At the expensive suit. The guarded convoy. The dangerous calmness in his eyes. None of this made sense. None of it should have felt safer than staying behind. Yet somehow it did. That realization scared me more than the men searching for me. Damien opened the SUV door himself. You have about 5 seconds before this decision gets made for you by people far crueler than I am. My throat tightened painfully. Who are those men? For the first time since leaving the cafe, real darkness crossed his face. Cold enough to send chills through me despite the humid city air. The reason, he said softly. I was bleeding beneath that bridge instead of buried under it. I should have walked away. Any sane person would have. But fear changes the shape of logic. 1 minute, I was standing in an alley behind a bookstore arguing with a man I barely knew. And the next, I was sliding into the back seat of a black SUV while strangers searched Manhattan, carrying my photograph. The door shut beside me with a heavy muted sound that instantly sealed me inside a different world. Everything smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Soft instrumental music played quietly through hidden speakers while tinted windows turned the city outside into blurred gray motion. Nothing inside the vehicle looked real. Not the polished wood details. Not the chilled bottles of water waiting beside the seats. Definitely not the man climbing in beside me wearing a tailored suit and carrying danger around him like a second shadow. Damien closed the door calmly while one of his men moved into the front passenger seat. Drive, Damien said quietly. The SUV pulled away from the curb immediately. My pulse had not slowed since leaving the cafe. Mia is still back there. Damien glanced toward me. Nobody will touch her. How can you know that? Because they are looking for leverage, not attention. The answer somehow made things worse. I stared at him while the city moved around us beyond darkened glass. You keep saying they. Who are they? Damien remained silent for several seconds. Long enough that I thought he might ignore the question completely. Then he leaned back against the seat with visible exhaustion. Men who believe power belongs to whoever inspires the most fear. And you do not. One corner of his mouth moved faintly. Not amusement this time. Something sadder. Claire, he said softly, I built an empire on fear. The honesty in his voice unsettled me more than denial would have. Rain streaked across the windows again as traffic slowed near Midtown. I noticed Damien shift slightly beside me, one hand pressing briefly against his shoulder beneath the suit jacket. The movement was subtle, controlled, but I saw pain flicker across his face before he buried it again. You should still be resting, I muttered before thinking. His eyes moved toward me immediately, sharp and unreadable. You sound concerned. You got blood on my couch. I am invested now. That earned me the smallest real smile I had seen from him yet. It vanished quickly, but something about seeing it made him feel unexpectedly human again. Not softer, just less untouchable. The silence between us stretched strangely after that. Not comfortable exactly. Heavy, loaded with questions neither of us knew how to ask. Outside, New York blurred past in silver rain and glowing brake lights, while inside the SUV, everything felt suspended from reality. Finally, I looked at him directly. Tell me the truth. Damien met my gaze calmly. About what? Why me? The question lingered between us. His expression changed slowly then, some invisible wall behind his eyes shifting just enough for me to glimpse something raw underneath. You helped me when you should have run. That cannot be enough. For most people, he said quietly, it would have been. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Damien looked away briefly toward the rain-streaked window before continuing in a lower voice. You have no idea how rare kindness becomes once fear enters every room before you do. The words settled heavily inside my chest. I studied him carefully then. The expensive suit, the guarded convoy, the controlled stillness. Suddenly I could see it beneath everything else. Loneliness, deep enough to hollow a person out. One of the men in front spoke quietly into his earpiece again. Route secured. Damien nodded once without looking up. Route secured. Like this was normal. Like people planned entire roads around keeping him alive. Where are you taking me? I asked softly. His gaze returned to mine. Somewhere safe. Your definition of safe is questionable. Another faint almost smile touched his mouth. Fair. The SUV turned sharply then, leaving Manhattan traffic behind as taller iron gates appeared ahead through the rain. Massive, black, guarded. My stomach dropped instantly. Beyond them stood the outline of an enormous estate hidden behind trees and stone walls right in the middle of New York, like something impossible carved out of another century. The gates opened before we even stopped moving. I stared through the rain-covered glass in disbelief. "Damien," I whispered carefully, "what exactly are you?" He looked at me for one long, unreadable second, while thunder rolled softly across the city skyline beyond the estate walls. Then he answered in the quietest voice yet. "The man your father once warned you about. My father used to say there were two kinds of dangerous men in New York. The loud ones everyone feared immediately, and the quiet ones people trusted right before everything fell apart." Sitting beside Damien as iron gates closed behind us, I finally understood which kind he meant. The estate stretched across several acres hidden behind stone walls and towering trees that blocked out the city beyond them. Manhattan still existed somewhere outside those gates. Taxi horns, crowded sidewalks, tiny apartments like mine. But inside the walls, the world changed completely. The driveway curved through rain-dark gardens lit by soft golden lamps until the mansion finally appeared fully through the storm. My breath caught before I could stop it. The place looked less like a home and more like something built to survive history. Massive stone walls, floor-to-ceiling windows glowing warm against the rain. Black luxury cars lined the circular driveway while suited guards stood beneath the covered entrance scanning the property with sharp professional focus. Nobody smiled. Nobody relaxed. The SUV stopped smoothly beneath the front entrance. One of Damien's men opened my door immediately, while another moved toward Damien the second. He stepped out. "Sir, the west side is secured." Damien nodded once. Any movement? Nothing confirmed yet. Their voices stayed low, but tension threaded beneath every word. I climbed out slowly, clutching my coat tighter against the cold rain while staring at the mansion in disbelief. "You live here?" Damien glanced toward me briefly. "Unfortunately." I almost laughed at the answer. "Unfortunately." As if people accidentally ended up owning private estates hidden inside New York City. Warm light spilled across marble floors the second we stepped inside. The interior somehow felt even more unreal than the outside. Dark wood walls, crystal chandeliers, massive fireplaces burning low against the storm outside. Everything smelled faintly like cedar smoke and expensive whiskey. Somewhere soft piano music played quietly through hidden speakers. It should have felt elegant. Instead, it felt controlled. Like every beautiful thing inside this house existed to distract from something darker underneath. Staff moved silently through the hallways dressed in black, each person lowering their eyes respectfully when Damien passed. Nobody questioned why he had arrived with a soaked bookstore employee wearing sneakers and yesterday's anxiety. That somehow unsettled me most of all. "Your room is upstairs," Damien said calmly while removing his coat. "Excuse me. You are staying here until this situation is resolved." I stopped walking immediately. "No," Damien turned toward me slowly. "Claire, you do not get to decide where I live now." Exhaustion flickered across his face again. "You are being hunted because of me." "Then maybe explain what is actually happening." Silence stretched heavily between us, while rain tapped softly against the towering windows. Damien loosened the cufflinks on his sleeves with controlled movements before finally speaking. 3 nights ago, there was an attempt to remove me from power." "Remove you from power," I repeated blankly. "That sounds suspiciously corporate for whatever this is." One corner of his mouth moved faintly. "I own several corporations." And his pale green eyes settled fully on mine then, sharp enough to make my heartbeat stumble. "And I also control territories people are willing to kill for." The room suddenly felt colder despite the fireplaces burning nearby. I stared at him carefully. "You are in the Mafia." The word sounded surreal spoken out loud. Damien did not flinch from it. People still use that word because it makes fear easier to understand. "Is it true?" His expression darkened slightly. "Yes." My pulse became painfully uneven. Part of me wanted to leave immediately. Another part remembered him bleeding beneath a bridge, asking me not to let him die. Those two versions of Damien refused to fit together inside my head. "Claire," he said quietly, stepping slightly closer, "look at me. I did despite myself. I would never allow harm to come to you." The certainty in his voice terrified me because it sounded like a vow instead of reassurance. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed sharply through the hallway behind us. A younger man in a dark suit approached quickly, tension visible across his face. "Sir," he said carefully, "we found the apartment in Queens." My stomach dropped instantly. Damien's entire posture changed. And the man hesitated, just long enough to make fear crawl ice cold down my spine. Someone got there before our people did. The silence after those words felt unbearable. Somewhere deeper inside the mansion, thunder rolled softly against the rain, but nobody in the hallway moved. Nobody breathed. I stared at the younger man while cold panic spread slowly through my chest. What do you mean somebody got there first? My voice sounded too loud against the quiet luxury surrounding us. The man glanced briefly toward Damien before answering carefully. Your apartment was searched. My stomach dropped so fast I thought I might actually collapse. Damien's expression became terrifyingly still. Not angry. Not shocked. Worse. Controlled in the way disasters probably looked right before everything exploded. Was anyone there? He asked quietly. No, sir. Relief hit me so hard my knees almost weakened. Mia was safe. Nobody had found me. Yet. Damien stepped away slightly, one hand brushing thoughtfully against his jaw, while his eyes darkened with calculations I could almost physically see happening behind them. How long ago? Less than 20 minutes. Damien nodded once. Sharp. Immediate. Double security here. Nobody enters without my authorization. Already done. The younger man disappeared down the hallway almost instantly after that, leaving me standing alone with a man who suddenly looked far more dangerous than he had 5 minutes earlier. I wrapped my arms tightly around myself. They went into my home. Damien turned back toward me slowly. Yes. Because of you. The words escaped. Before I could soften them, something unreadable flickered across his face. Guilt maybe. Yes. At least he did not lie. Rain hammered harder against the windows now, while firelight flickered gold across the marble floors. The mansion suddenly felt less like safety and more like a fortress waiting for war. Claire. His voice softened slightly. Look at me. I hated that I did automatically. Damien stepped closer carefully, leaving enough distance that I never felt trapped, even though every instinct told me he could control entire cities if he wanted to. You are safe here. You cannot promise that. His gaze held mine steadily. I can. The certainty in his voice made my pulse uneven again. I looked away first. That is the problem, I whispered. You sound like a man who actually believes that. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Damien exhaled quietly and loosened the knot of his tie with visible exhaustion. The movement drew my attention instantly to the faint redness spreading beneath the bandage near his shoulder. My frustration dissolved into concern before I could stop it. You are bleeding again. Damien glanced down briefly like he had forgotten his injury existed. It is nothing. That is what people say right before passing out dramatically. A faint tired smile touched his mouth again. You always this stubborn? Only around emotionally unavailable mafia bosses. The smile deepened slightly before fading again just as quickly. Strange how much younger he looked when it appeared. Less untouchable. Less carved from stone. He moved toward the staircase slowly then, one hand brushing the railing for balance, so subtle most people would never notice it. I noticed. Where are you going? To work. I stared at him in disbelief. You were nearly dying under a bridge less than 24 hours ago. That was inconvenient timing. Damien. He paused halfway up the staircase and looked back at me. Rainlight and chandelier glow caught against the sharp lines of his face while exhaustion shadowed the green of his eyes. For one strange second, he looked less like a feared crime boss and more like a man carrying too much weight for too long. People. Depend on me, he said quietly. Whether I deserve that or not. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard again. Before I could answer, another man appeared from the hallway carrying a small silver tray. Sir, he said carefully, Dr. Romano has arrived. Damien's jaw tightened instantly. I did not call a doctor. Your uncle did. Something dangerously close to irritation crossed Damien's face. Of course he did. He looked back toward me afterward, studying me with that same unreadable intensity from the bridge. You should rest. I am not sure resting is possible anymore. His expression softened just enough to hurt unexpectedly. You will adapt faster than you think. Then he disappeared upstairs beneath the warm chandelier light, while thunder rolled softly outside the mansion windows. I stood frozen in the middle of a house built for dangerous men, staring after the mafia boss who somehow still remembered to make me coffee. I should have hated him by then. That would have been easier. Simpler. Normal people did not end up trapped inside fortified mansions with wounded mafia bosses who spoke like heartbreak wrapped in expensive suits. But sometime around midnight, while rain whispered against towering windows and the house settled into exhausted silence. Hatred became impossible. I could not sleep. The bedroom they gave me was larger than my entire apartment in Queens. Soft cream-colored walls. A fireplace glowing low against the storm outside. Silk sheets that probably cost more than my monthly rent. It felt beautiful in the same way museums feel beautiful. Untouchable. Cold. I sat near the window wrapped in one of the oversized sweaters somebody had left for me when soft piano music drifted faintly through the hallway outside my room. Slow. Melancholy. Human. Curiosity pulled me from the bed before common sense could stop me. The mansion looked different at night. Quieter. Shadows stretched across marble floors while golden lamps cast soft light against dark wood walls. Somewhere downstairs, guards spoke quietly into radios, but otherwise the entire estate felt suspended in silence. The piano music grew clearer as I followed it down the hallway, toward a partially open door near the west side of the house. I stopped immediately when I saw him. Damien sat alone beside a black grand piano in a dimly lit room lined floor to ceiling with books. He was not playing, just sitting there with one hand resting against the keys like he had forgotten what music sounded like halfway through remembering it. He wore a black sweater instead of the suit now, and somehow that looked more dangerous because it made him seem real instead of untouchable. Softer, tired, human. A half-finished glass of whiskey rested beside him untouched. He noticed me instantly, of course. Men like Damien probably noticed everything. "You should be asleep," he said quietly without turning fully toward me. "You should be in a hospital." A faint, almost smile touched his mouth. We continue having the same argument. I stepped into the room carefully. Books surrounded us everywhere. History, philosophy, poetry. Not what I expected from a mafia boss whose men carried earpieces and spoke about securing routes like military operations. "You read all these?" Damien glanced toward the shelves briefly. "Most. That is annoyingly attractive." This time he actually laughed softly. The sound caught me completely off guard. Warm, low, real. It lasted maybe 2 seconds before fading back into silence, but the room somehow felt different afterward. More dangerous in a way I could not explain. I moved closer slowly until I stood beside the piano. Up close, exhaustion shadowed his face heavily now that nobody else was around to see it. The controlled mask had cracks tonight. "Why are you really awake?" I asked softly. Damien stared at the piano keys for a long moment before answering. "Because every time I close my eyes lately, somebody dies." The honesty in his voice hollowed something inside my chest. "Damien, do not pity me, Claire." His tone stayed calm, but something painful lived underneath it. "I made choices. I built this life knowingly. Then why do you sound like you hate it?" Silence, heavy enough to shake the room apart. Damien leaned back slowly in the piano bench, studying me with those pale green eyes that somehow always felt too intense. "For breathing normally. Because power is lonely," he admitted quietly. "People obey me, fear me, need things from me." His gaze lowered briefly before returning to mine again. "You are the first person in years who touched me without wanting something in return." My heartbeat became painfully uneven. Rain tapped softly against the giant windows while the fireplace crackled low beside us. Damien looked exhausted suddenly. Not physically, soul-deep exhausted. The kind no doctor could fix. "That night beneath the bridge," he said softly. "You looked at me like I was still worth saving." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. "Maybe you are." Damien's expression shifted then. Something raw flickered across his face so quickly it almost hurt to witness. He stood slowly from the piano bench despite the obvious pain in his shoulder and stepped closer until only inches separated us. Not touching, never forcing, but close enough that I could feel warmth radiating from him beneath the soft lamplight. "Claire," he whispered quietly, "you are becoming dangerous to me in ways bullets never were." Some people believe love arrives gently. Quiet smiles, safe choices, easy beginnings. They are wrong. Sometimes it arrives carrying storms behind it. Sometimes it looks at you with tired green eyes and asks whether you are brave enough to stay once you understand the danger. I could not breathe properly after Damien said those words. The library suddenly felt too small around us. Too warm. Rain whispered against the massive windows while firelight flickered gold across the sharp lines of his face. Dangerous to me. The confession echoed through my chest harder than it should have. because I understood exactly what he meant. Damien Moretti was not afraid of enemies, or bullets, or power. He was afraid of caring about something enough to lose it. And somehow, that something had become me. Damien, I whispered softly, but I had no idea what came after his name. He studied me carefully, like he was waiting for me to run. Maybe expecting it. Honestly, part of me still wanted to. My entire life had changed in less than 48 hours. One rainy night, one impossible stranger, beneath a bridge. And now I stood inside a mansion built for a mafia empire, while the man who ruled it looked at me like I held the last piece of humanity he had left. You should hate me, he said quietly. Probably. A faint sad smile touched his mouth. Yet you do not. I swallowed hard because honesty suddenly felt dangerous too. You make that difficult. Something shifted in his expression then. Softer. Almost disbelieving. Like kindness still surprised him no matter how many times it appeared. Thunder rolled softly outside while the storm deepened over the city beyond the estate walls. Damien moved slightly closer, careful enough that I could step away if I wanted to. He always left me room to choose. That mattered more than he probably realized. Claire, he said quietly. If things were different, he stopped there. The unfinished sentence hung heavily between us. If things were different. If he were not Damien Moretti. If I were not standing in the center of a war I barely understood. If fate had not decided to throw us together beneath cold rain and bad timing. I looked up at him slowly. But they are not different. His jaw tightened slightly. No, silence wrapped around us after that. Heavy, honest, the kind that changes people without permission. Somewhere downstairs, a grandfather clock chimed softly through the mansion halls. Midnight. Another day ending. Another beginning neither of us saw coming. My eyes drifted toward the piano beside us. Play something. Damien blinked once, clearly caught off guard by the request. I have not played in years. That was not a no. Another one of those rare, real smiles appeared briefly. Small but devastating. He sat back down at the piano slowly while I remained beside the fireplace watching him. For a moment, he simply stared at the keys like they belonged to another version of himself entirely. Then finally his fingers moved. The melody was quiet. Slow. Beautiful in a way that hurt unexpectedly. Not polished. Not perfect. Human. I listened while rain slid down the windows and firelight painted gold across the dark room. Damien did not look like a feared mafia boss at the piano. He looked lonely. A man. Carrying too much silence for too many years. Halfway through the song, he glanced toward me without stopping the melody. You are staring. I am trying to understand how somebody like you exists. His fingers slowed slightly against the keys. And I wrapped my arms around myself tighter against the strange ache growing inside my chest. I think, I admitted softly, you became dangerous long before I met you. The final note faded gently into silence after that. Damien looked at me across the piano with those impossible green eyes full of storms and exhaustion and something far more frightening now. Hope. Real hope. The kind powerful men should never place in other people. Slowly, he stood and crossed the room toward me again. Close enough now that I could hear his breathing beneath the rain outside. Claire, he said quietly, if you stay here, everything changes. My heartbeat stumbled painfully. Maybe it already did. For the first time since finding him beneath that bridge, Damien looked completely unguarded. Not powerful. Not feared. Just a man standing in front of the only person who ever saw him bleeding and stayed anyway. Then softly, almost like a confession meant only for the storm to hear, he whispered, you were supposed to be one mistake in the rain. His eyes held mine completely. Instead, you became the only future I can still picture.